You're watching two kids argue over a toy in a sandbox, and it escalates fast, shoving, yelling, one of them throwing sand. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a slightly unsettling thought creeps in. Is this just what humans do? Is conflict, real organized conflict, baked into us from the very beginning? Or is war something we actually had to invent? Archaeologists and anthropologists have been arguing about this for decades, and the answer isn't as settled as either side of that argument would like you to believe. So when did ancient humans actually start going to war? And is always really the honest answer? The evidence takes you somewhere far messier than a simple yes or no. Let's start with the most cited piece of evidence for genuinely ancient, organized human violence, because it's dramatic enough to anchor an entire debate on its own. At a site called Jebel Sahaba in modern-day Sudan, archaeologists uncovered a cemetery containing dozens of skeletons, many showing clear evidence of violent death, including stone projectile points still embedded directly in bone. For decades, this site, dated to roughly 13,000 years ago, was widely cited as the oldest known evidence of organized human warfare, a single brutal battle frozen in the archaeological record. But a 2021 reanalysis led by researcher Isabelle Crevecoeur and colleagues, using more advanced imaging techniques on the original remains, found something that complicated the tidy one big battle narrative considerably. The pattern of wounds, including partially healed injuries alongside fresh fatal ones, suggested repeated episodes of violence occurring over an extended period, rather than a single, decisive, large-scale conflict. In other words, one of archaeology's flagship pieces of evidence for ancient warfare may actually be evidence of something slightly different. Sustained, recurring violence within a community over time, rather than one dramatic battle between two organized armies. And part of why a single site can generate this much disagreement comes down to something surprisingly basic. Researchers don't fully agree on what actually counts as war in the first place. Anthropologists studying conflict have generally distinguished between individual homicide, a single killing arising from a personal dispute, and organized warfare, which typically implies group coordination, shared intent, and often some form of leadership or planning directed at a rival group as a whole rather than at one specific person. The trouble is that skeletal remains, however informative, rarely preserve clear evidence of intent, planning, or group coordination. A cluster of bodies with violent wounds could represent a single coordinated raid, several unrelated violent incidents that happen to occur in roughly the same location over time, or something in between that doesn't map cleanly onto either modern category at all. This definitional ambiguity isn't a minor academic footnote. It's a huge part of why the exact same physical evidence at sites like Jebel Sahaba can be read by different researchers as either the oldest known battle in human history or something considerably murkier and harder to label with confidence. So if even our best-known ancient war site turns out to be more complicated than the simple story suggests, does that mean organized warfare is actually a much later human invention? This is where the debate genuinely splits among researchers, and it's worth laying out both sides honestly rather than picking a winner, because this remains a real, unresolved argument within anthropology and archaeology. One major camp, sometimes associated with researchers like Richard Wrangham, points to evidence of coalitionary violence in our closest living relatives as proof that the roots of organized intergroup conflict likely predate humans entirely. The most famous supporting evidence comes from the Gom-chimpanzee war, a multi-year conflict observed and documented by primatologist Jane Goodall between 1974 and 1978, in which a single chimpanzee community in Tanzania split into two groups, and the larger group proceeded to systematically, over a period of roughly 4 years, hunt down and kill nearly every member of the smaller splinter group. This wasn't a single chaotic skirmish. It involved repeated, coordinated patrols specifically targeting individuals from the rival group, a pattern researchers in this camp argue looks remarkably similar to organized raiding behavior in some human societies, suggesting the psychological and behavioral machinery for coalitionary violence may be considerably older than our own species. Here's a pattern interrupt worth sitting with. If this theory holds, the instinct behind organized group violence may not be a uniquely human invention at all. It might be something we inherited, already fully formed, from an ancestor we shared with chimpanzees millions of years before either species existed in its current form. There's also a modern ethnographic angle to this debate, drawn from studying hunter-gatherer and small-scale societies that still exist or existed within recent historical memory, rather than relying purely on ancient skeletal remains. Researchers including Napoleon Chagnon, who conducted extensive fieldwork among the Yanomami people of the Amazon starting in the 1960s, documented notably high rates of male mortality attributed to intergroup and intragroup violence within that specific society, Findings Shangyan and others have cited as evidence that lethal conflict can be a persistent, significant feature of small-scale traditional societies, not merely a byproduct of modern state-level civilization. But researchers on the other side of this debate, including Fry, have pointed to a wide range of other documented hunter-gatherer and small-scale societies showing dramatically lower rates of lethal conflict, arguing that the Yanomami and similarly violent societies represent one end of a genuinely wide spectrum, rather than a universal baseline representative of all traditional human societies everywhere. This matters for the ancient warfare question specifically because it undermines any simple assumption that a single observed hunter-gatherer society, however well studied, can safely stand in for how all ancient humans generally behaved. The honest picture emerging from this ethnographic research is one of significant variation, not a single fixed, universal level of human violence waiting to be uncovered. But wait, a small number of documented chimpanzee conflicts, however striking, is a long way from proving that ancient human hunter-gatherers were routinely organizing themselves into armies and marching off to battle. What does the actual archaeological evidence from early human societies specifically show? This is where the second major camp in this debate, associated with researchers including anthropologist Douglas Fry, pushes back hard against the idea that organized warfare has always been a defining feature of human existence. Fry and like-minded researchers have argued that clear, unambiguous archaeological evidence for organized warfare, meaning coordinated, planned, group versus group lethal conflict involving weapons specifically designed for fighting other humans, along with defensive structures like fortifications, is notably rare or entirely absent in the archaeological record before roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, right around the time many human societies were beginning to settle into permanent or semi-permanent agricultural communities. Their argument isn't that ancient humans were never violent. Interpersonal violence, individual killings, and small-scale conflict likely existed throughout human history. Their argument is specifically about organized, sustained warfare, involving planned campaigns and dedicated fighting forces, which they contend required a level of social complexity, resource concentration, and territorial stake that simple, mobile, low-population hunter-gatherer bands generally didn't have much reason to develop. So the honest state of this debate isn't war has always existed versus war is entirely a modern invention. It's a genuinely contested question about scale and organization. Did ancient humans always possess the capacity and inclination for coordinated group violence, simply expressing it less often due to low population density and few concentrated resources worth fighting over? Or did something more fundamental shift once agriculture, permanent settlements, and accumulated surplus resources gave humans, for the first time, something substantial enough to organize an actual war over? There's a genuine methodological challenge underlying much of this debate too, one worth naming directly. Distinguishing a hunting weapon from a weapon specifically intended for use against other humans is often far harder than it sounds. A stone-tipped arrow capable of killing an antelope is, mechanically, equally capable of killing a person, which means a projectile point recovered from a human skeleton doesn't automatically prove the existence of specialized war technology. Only that an existing hunting tool was used on that particular occasion against another human being. Archaeologists studying the emergence of dedicated weapons of war generally look for more specific indicators, including weapon designs poorly suited for hunting but well suited for combat against an armed, upright, defending opponent, alongside defensive architecture, and the discovery of weapon caches specifically positioned in ways suggesting stockpiling for conflict rather than routine subsistence use. These more unambiguous markers of dedicated war technology do appear to become considerably more common and more elaborate specifically in the archaeological record following the spread of agriculture, adding further weight to the argument that organized warfare, whatever its deepest evolutionary roots, became a far more materially developed, specialized undertaking only once settled societies had both the motive and the accumulated resources to invest in it. Now here's where the archaeological evidence gets genuinely compelling on the something shifted side of that argument, because the sites that most clearly resemble what most people would confidently call organized warfare cluster, specifically around the transition to farming, not before it. At a site called Talheim in modern-day Germany, dated to roughly 7,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 34 individuals, including men, women, and children, showing clear evidence of deliberate, systematic killing, primarily through blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with close-range, weapon-based attacks rather than accidental death or natural disaster. A similarly disturbing site at Schöneck-Kilienstätten, also in Germany and dated to a comparable period, roughly 7,000 years ago, revealed remains showing not only lethal head trauma but evidence suggesting deliberate mutilation of lower leg bones, which some researchers have interpreted as an attempt to prevent the dead from being able to walk in an afterlife, or possibly as a way to permanently incapacitate captives before killing them. Sites like these dated firmly within the early Neolithic period, after agriculture had already taken hold in the region, show exactly the kind of coordinated, large-scale, systematic violence, targeting entire communities including non-combatants, that fits far more comfortably under the label of organized warfare than the more ambiguous, possibly repeated individual violence found at older sites like Jebel Sahaba. But wait, Talheim and Schöneck-Kilienstätten are firmly agricultural societies. What about direct evidence closer to the hunter-gatherer world, from a period genuinely before farming reshaped how humans lived? Doesn't that leave a critical gap in the argument? This is where a site called Nataruk in modern-day Kenya becomes central to the debate, and it complicates things considerably. In 2016, researcher Marta Mirazon-Lar and colleagues published findings in the journal Nature, describing a roughly 10,000-year-old site containing the remains of at least 27 individuals, showing clear signs of violent death, including embedded stone projectile points, skull fractures, and evidence consistent with bound hands on at least one individual, all found among a population that appears to have been genuine hunter-gatherers, predating the local spread of agriculture in the region. This finding matters enormously for the debate specifically because it pushes clear evidence of what looks like coordinated, lethal group violence back into a genuinely pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer context, directly challenging the argument that organized violence required farming and settled life to emerge in the first place. Critics of this interpretation, however, including some researchers aligned with Fry's broader argument, have pointed out that a single site, however striking, doesn't necessarily establish a widespread recurring pattern, and that questions remain about whether Nataruk represents a genuinely isolated, unusual massacre or actual evidence of a broader, more common pattern of hunter-gatherer intergroup conflict that simply hasn't been as well preserved or discovered elsewhere in the archaeological record. So even our clearest pre-agricultural example of what looks like organized violence remains genuinely, actively contested among the researchers who study it most closely, which tells you something important about where this field actually stands. This isn't a settled question with an agreed-upon textbook answer waiting to be memorized. It's a live, ongoing argument, playing out across multiple competing excavation sites, reanalyzed skeletal remains, and genuinely differing interpretations of the exact same physical evidence. Now here's a factor almost every researcher across this debate agrees mattered, regardless of which broader camp they fall into: population density and resource concentration. Once human societies transitioned toward agriculture, populations grew significantly denser, communities became more permanently rooted to specific, defensible territory, and for the first time, groups began accumulating substantial, storable surplus resources, stockpiled grain, livestock, permanent structures, all genuinely worth fighting over and defending, in a way that simply didn't exist for small, low-density hunter-gatherer bands with comparatively little to steal and considerably more room to simply relocate rather than fight. Archaeological evidence for defensive structures, dedicated fortifications, moats, palisade walls, becomes notably more common and more elaborate specifically in the archaeological record following the spread of agriculture, a pattern that fits comfortably with the idea that organized warfare, even if the underlying capacity for coalitionary violence existed much earlier, became a far more common, sustained, and materially motivated feature of human life, once there was finally something substantial and stationary worth organizing an army to take. This broader question, whether organized society made humans more violent or less, connects to another genuinely contested debate worth mentioning directly, one that extends this discussion all the way into the modern era. Psychologist Steven Pinker's 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, argued, using long-run historical and archaeological violence statistics, that overall rates of violent death have actually declined significantly over the broad sweep of human history, suggesting that state formation, centralized governance, and organized legal systems, whatever their role in enabling large-scale organized warfare, ultimately reduce the overall proportion of any given population likely to die violently compared to smaller-scale, less centralized societies. This argument has drawn substantial pushback from several anthropologists, including Fry, who have specifically challenged some of the archaeological data and statistical methods Pinker relied on, arguing that available evidence for extremely high violent death rates in some cited prehistoric and small-scale societies is considerably less certain and less representative than Pinker's broader narrative suggests. The specific numbers in this debate remain genuinely disputed among specialists. But it's a useful reminder that the story of ancient warfare doesn't end tidily with war began at some specific point and only ever grew worse from there. Even among researchers who broadly agree that organized warfare intensified alongside settled, resource-concentrated societies, real disagreement remains about what that ultimately meant for an individual human's overall odds of dying violently across the long arc of history. A chimpanzee community in 1970s Tanzania methodically eliminates a rival splinter group over 4 patient years, suggesting the machinery for coordinated lethal violence may predate our own species by millions of years. A hunter-gatherer population at Nataruk, roughly 10,000 years ago, dies with bound hands and embedded arrowheads. Evidence is either of an isolated massacre or a genuine early war, depending entirely on which researcher you ask. A Neolithic farming community at Talheim is wiped out almost entirely, men, women, and children alike, in an attack systematic enough to leave no reasonable doubt about coordination and intent. A modern nation-state, thousands of years later, builds fortifications, stockpiles resources, and organizes standing armies specifically to defend territory and surplus wealth that a hunter-gatherer ancestor 10,000 generations earlier would never have possessed enough of to bother fighting over in the first place. None of this settles the underlying philosophical question the sandbox scaring you at the start of this video was really asking. Is conflict simply what humans are, waiting only for an opportunity, or is organized war specifically something humans built, layered on top of an older, more general capacity for aggression? Once settled life finally gave that capacity something substantial enough to fight over. The honest, unglamorous answer researchers across this genuinely divided field would likely agree on is this. The raw capacity for coalitionary, group-based violence appears to run very deep, plausibly reaching back before our own species even existed. But organized, sustained warfare, in the fuller sense most people actually picture when they hear the word, war with planning, dedicated fighting forces, fortifications, and campaigns rather than isolated incidents, appears to concentrate overwhelmingly in the archaeological record. Only after humans settled down, built up something worth defending, and, for the first time in our species' long history, actually had a reason substantial enough to organize around. Which brings us back to that sandbox, 2 kids shoving each other over a single plastic toy. It's tempting to see something dark and ancient in that moment, proof that conflict has always simply been who we are. But the more accurate, more interesting reading might be this. What you're actually watching isn't proof of an eternal human war instinct. It's a preview of something that needed centuries of accumulated stuff worth fighting over, before it ever grew into anything resembling the organized, devastating conflicts we now associate with the word war at all. We didn't inherit war. We built it, the moment we finally had something worth fighting for.